Andreas Antonopoulos, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me in this hangout.
Hey Jeffrey, I'm very excited. Since we're streaming live, if you send me the YouTube, I'd like to tweet it out to my followers so they can join us too.
Okay. I wonder how I do. Like I can just get the link. I suppose you want them to join us live, or just after we're done.
No, live YouTube link would be perfect.
Okay.
I can throw it up there if you send it in the chat or something.
Yeah.
Or email it to me, whatever works.
I'm going to put this in the chat. We had a bang-up time talking the other day on Let's Talk Bitcoin. It was really great, and that little conversation was quite a hit online. You remember?
Yeah, absolutely. I always enjoy chatting with you, Jeffrey, and I think it was a great topic. The nature of scientific discovery and disruption of entrenched paradigms and dogma in science was very interesting.
Well, it was funny because you were so eloquent, and I was so touched by it. I said, my God, I'd love to have a transcript of that. But, you know, in today's online world, you say something like that, and next thing you know, you've got a transcript in your inbox, which is exactly what happened.
Yes, I saw that when I went online. It was pretty cool.
That was cute. So I wanted to kind of like back up a second here and raise a couple of issues that you are in a very special position to sort of discuss that I feel like I'm not quite fully up on. One thing is concerns this New York financial regulation of Bitcoin. I mean, we're seeing very aggressive attempts these days to essentially to control Bitcoin, to regulate it in a way that would even be more intensely regulated than regular cash. And I think, I mean, it's interesting because early on I got into the Bitcoin world about a year and a half ago now. And the most common thing I heard from people who were sort of debunkers of it was, forget it. This will never be allowed. The powers that be will stop this through some sort of regulation. We've all known this kind of thing is coming. Everybody anticipated it. It's not as if we're naive. You know, we understand this. There's nothing in this world that's allowed to exist that's not heavily regulated and controlled by the state. I guess my question to you is, how substantial a change is this? Do you think it's affected the mood in the Bitcoin world? Do you think this is just a passing annoyance or a fundamental shift?
I think it's a passing annoyance, and I think it will greatly annoy the citizens of the state of New York, who will be deprived of financial privacy at a time when financial privacy is so difficult to achieve, when totalitarian financial surveillance is almost taken for granted. You know, people complain about the NSA tapping our phones, but they seem to take it for granted that every podunk sheriff's office can pull your credit card files because of the Patriot Act Section 215 and share them with each other with reckless abandon and track your every financial move online. And it is incredible what people can get from that information. Makes everybody blackmailable. And so the thing is, the financial information and financial privacy, we have this weird situation where regulators try to persuade us that the way to create consumer protection is to give up financial privacy. And financial privacy is consumer protection, and giving up all of your private information in order to interact with someone else, consumer protection, it's incumbent protection, and it's actually antithetical to consumer protection. It destroys the possibility of an individual to protect their identity from identity theft, and it exposes them to every hacker who can get into any of the records of any of the companies or regulators or intermediaries who are involved in the system. I mean, that's one of the main pain points and problems with the current financial system. So they're taking a feature of these new peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies, which is the fact that you don't have to provide all of this personal financial information and become a victim of identity theft, and turning it around and trying to eradicate that feature by making Bitcoin conform more to the established yet completely failed banking practices of totalitarian financial surveillance. And guess what? Bitcoin doesn't fit into that hole. The peg doesn't fit into that hole. And that's not a bug. That's a feature. It's not a bug that it's difficult to make peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies comply with these ridiculous draconian totalitarian regulations that New York's trying to pass. It's a feature that they can't comply. They shouldn't be able to comply. They disrupt the very nature of totalitarian financial surveillance, and that's a good thing. That's how it should be. They change the balance of power from financial service industry companies that can collect everything about everyone and empower the consumer to be able to protect their own financial information from these parasitic organizations that want to apply their own view of the world. And so that's a feature. And I don't think Bitcoin's going to fit in well with this regulatory fantasy. I think what it's going to do is it's going to isolate New York. And I'm not surprised this came out of New York. Of course New York is going to be resistant to peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies. London and New York are the last bastion of old-style parasitic capitalism, and they will resist to the very end because their very existence is threatened by flattening of financial opportunity and transparency, which obviously threatens those who are able to extract profits without risk from a rigged casino-like game as they do in New York. So yeah, of course this happened in New York. It's going to happen in London too, and what it's going to do is it's going to cut off New York and London from the possibility of taking advantage of these technologies.
But,
and the rest of the world is going to move on.
It's one thing if this were Mississippi or Nevada or something, but when it's coming out of New York, that affects not just New York, but the whole of the world economy at some levels. I mean, that's why this is why the significance of this is notable, right?
Well, it affects the whole of the old world economy. It actually makes it harder for banks to co-opt and adopt Bitcoin because these regulations will make it harder for companies in that space to operate in New York, which will push those companies to operate from other jurisdictions and to start jurisdiction shopping. Bitcoin doesn't care about borders. It's like the internet, so if you squeeze it in one place, it will just move somewhere else. I don't think it's really
happening. Do you see evidence that that's already happening? I talked to I guess somebody from Coinapult a couple of weeks ago, and their wonderful new services they're not even making available to U.S. citizens just because of regime uncertainty.
Right. Well, I mean, what's going to happen is you're going to see these services thrive elsewhere, and they're going to develop elsewhere. And if you thought Bitcoin was about making the shopping habits of 300 million Americans, more easy, then you're missing the point. Bitcoin, I think, has always been about the other 6.5 billion, and it's going to happen in the lives of the other 6.5 billion because they need it more. And it's going to connect the world in yet to be imagined ways, and eventually it's going to be irrelevant what New York does. I mean, the old-style parasitic capitalism system of New York and Wall Street is a dying beast, and people who choose Bitcoin choose it because they don't want to be part of that system, and the people who can't be part of that system because they're financially excluded, the other 6.5 billion, will quite gladly use something that is an alternative currency that doesn't play by the rules of totalitarian financial surveillance and profiteering and parasitic capitalism as they play in New York. So let them have their little dying empire of failed corporate welfare, and their pretend card, tower of cards that's on the verge of collapse any day now. They've tried to pretend that the economy is okay, injected $4 trillion into their little Ponzi scheme, and no one's buying. Retail investors are leaving the markets in droves. Mortgage applications are down, bonds are collapsing. There's no yield anywhere in these markets anymore. And so regular investors are basically trying to save and in some cases using alternative currencies to do that. Here's what this reminds me of. Have you heard, do you know the story of the Red Flag Act?
No, tell me about the story.
So in the late 1800s, there was a race on for the automobile industry, and in the beginning, Britain, which was the industrial behemoth of the age, was winning, of course, because they had the first steam engines, they had the first run of the Industrial Revolution, and had actually started building cars long before America had jumped in to this game, and they were actually winning the automobile race. Then in 1896, after a couple of high-profile articles where pedestrians were killed by cars, by these new experimental and nefarious machines that made infernal noises and killed pedestrians left, right, and center, they decided to bring down some serious regulations. So in 1896, the British Parliament passed the Red Flag Act. And what this act required was that every one of these newfangled automobiles be operated by a 3-person crew, a driver, an engineer, and a flagman, and that the flagman is the person who holds a red flag and runs 100 yards ahead of the car to warn pedestrians of the imminent arrival of a death machine. And so, of course, what this did was two things. First of all, it made ownership of an automobile limited to those who could afford a 3-person crew, who were pretty much, only the aristocracy. It further marginalized the ownership of cars, and also it restricted their use to the speed of a running man or a horse. This law was heavily lobbied by the coach manufacturers and horse-drawn carriage manufacturers and the stable owners and all of the incumbents in the horse and buggy business who didn't like this idea of the automobile. Meanwhile, in the US, an opposite thing was happening, and cars actually became much more of everyman thing. And Henry Ford was beginning a revolution in industrial production and trying to bring a Model T and make it simple and inexpensive and something that anybody could own and could operate on their own and use the full advantage of the car. Well, guess what? Britain lost the automobile race. That law was on the books for, I think, 2 decades, completely destroyed the automobile industry in the UK, isolated the UK from the automobile revolution, set them back, and the US won. And this is exactly the lesson that the New York regulators need to learn, which is that if you create an onerous industry regulation that is primarily informed by the incumbents who want to keep this competition out of their backyard on a technology that is disruptive, that is populist, that is equalizing, that is empowering, that is viral, and that has low barriers to entry, all you're going to do is exclude your own citizens, damage the development of the industry in your own backyard, and promote it elsewhere. And that's exactly what's happening. So many companies are already deciding not to do business in New York, not to do business with New Yorkers, and if this type of regulation spreads elsewhere in the US, more and more people are going to do this abroad. And we're going to lose all of the jobs and all of the opportunity of unseating the incumbent and highly corrupted financial services industry that isn't generating jobs, but is in fact destroying jobs by the millions for the last decade. And we're going to lose the possibility of the new jobs that can be brought to us by this technology.
It's a tremendous distraction too, because if you think about the Bitcoin space right now, at least as I understand it, the most urgent need is for more user-friendly interfaces. I think about the history of email. When it first came along, it was awkward. There was a ton of spam. The email addresses were sort of strange and unmemorable. There was a lot of development that needed to take place, but there wasn't a lot of attempts to regulate it at the time, so there could be a real focus on improving user experience. And my sense is that that's where we need to be going with Bitcoin right now, but instead you've got all this focus on compliance, which is tremendously annoying.
It's not just compliance, it's compliance to a set of rules designed by the incumbent to keep out competition. Now, imagine if in the early days of the internet, the FCC had decided that in order to operate an email server or a web server, you had to register with the FCC as a broadcaster, and you had to be subject to the FCC regulations. Imagine if Congress had allowed them to do that. Imagine if in order to have an email address, you had to register with a post office. They would have killed the internet in the US, probably delayed it in the rest of the world, but it would have gone on regardless. And they didn't do that. They didn't allow the post office and the telephone companies to write the regulation for the very industry that was disrupting them. Yet in New York, they're allowing the banks to write the regulation, and they're writing regulation that takes all of the features of Bitcoin, which are the lightweight account ownership and the fact that you don't need to do all of this identity thieving actions where you reveal all of your personal information to every single merchant you interact with and then hope they don't get hacked and you don't read about them in the news the next day, as is happening with credit cards every single day. An impossible race that consumers are losing, where the industry shifts all of the burden of security onto the consumer. And they're allowing these people to write the regulations to turn Bitcoin into exactly the same thing. The whole point of Bitcoin is that you don't need to provide 3 forms of ID to open an account. The whole point of Bitcoin is that you can shop with a single click online or transfer money without having to identify yourself, without having to fill in your address, your information, your social security number, or give them a token that can be stolen. The whole point of Bitcoin is that it removes that friction. So what they're doing now is adding friction. And of course, they do it with the idea that they're going to protect against terrorism, protect against money laundering, protect consumers against theft and fraud. Well, guess what? The big banks that paid you to write that regulation, they are doing the money laundering, they are doing the fraud, they are funding terrorism. Terrorists don't need Bitcoin to get funded. We dropped $84 billion in giant pallets of money in Iraq and then forgot about them. They got their money there. They don't need to be funded through Bitcoin. And drug launderers use HSBC and Wachovia, and then our regulators don't even punish them. This is a joke. This isn't protecting anyone. What it's protecting JP Morgan. It's protecting JP Morgan from competition that they're about to lose badly. And guess what? It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Because Bitcoin will persist and Bitcoin will happen everywhere.
I'm intrigued by your vision of the rest of the world dragging the U.S. into the 21st century. We've known from the very beginning, when we first started talking about the subject, that money requires a certain network effect. I mean, it's valuable because other people find it valuable, and there's a sort of an escalation of the moneyness of any kind of new commodity, which we're seeing happen in real time. And I'm intrigued by your vision that the network effects are going to be taking place in the developing world, mainly, first, and then eventually spill over to the so-called developed world.
Well, of course, because we're living through a period which is quite historical. We're living through the largest currency crisis that has ever happened before. We're living through the collapse of the US dollar as a world reserve currency, through the de-dollarization policies of China and Russia. We're living through the collapse of the American empire as an empire through hubris. And the end result is that the world is going to be a very different place. America can't afford to be the world's policeman or the world's banker anymore because America is bankrupt. And so the rest of the world is now going to emerge into a new economic reality, and using the dollar and playing by the rules of the dollar and playing by the rules of a regulator in New York is not going to make sense to everybody else. So you're going to see that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are going to emerge and are going to be used internationally to enable international trade, to enable international financial development, loans, to enable remittances, and billions of people out there who have no access to financial services or very limited access to financial services are going to start taking their financial future into their own hands. And at that point, you can still continue to operate in the backwater of the USA with the worthless US dollar as it declines with ever more corruption and parasitic capitalism, or you can decide to join the rest of the world in using a cryptocurrency, and a lot of Americans are going to make that choice too. It's inevitable. This stuff is not going to be constrained by borders. You can't build a fence around water.
I love this vision that I think a lot of people imagine that monetary policy and currency payment systems are matters of sort of top-down policy. The Treasury Department says this is our money. The U.S. Senate says this is our official system. But your vision of the future really imagines a kind of a bottom-up revolution. Like, regardless of what the elites say, people are going to defy the priorities of the powers that be and just adopt this because it's a superior technology.
I remember a time when the American people mocked the idea of centrally planned economies and laughed with glee at the collapse of the Soviet Union as they suddenly discovered that the millions of tractors they thought were being made were in fact hundreds of thousands of rusting hulks that weren't being made because the central planning economy collapsed under its own weight. And yet now somehow, just 2 decades later, suddenly America has decided that the best way to handle our economy is through central planning. That's ridiculous. And we used to laugh at that concept. And now we have the Fed investing $4 trillion into the banks so that they can centrally manage the economy with trickle down through the S&P 500. And 250 million people at least have already checked out of that economy because it's giving them nothing, and really see no future in that economy. They already know that that's not their economy. That's somebody else's economy. It takes the profits to somebody else, and it doesn't return anything. So that kind of centrally planned thing won't last very long. We know that. We laughed at the Soviets for trying it. And it used to be a pretty well understood concept in American economics that decentralized markets that give them maximum freedom and decision making at the local level based on the free interaction between individuals and the ability to set price as a guide for allocating resources is the most efficient way to allocate capital. Well, the fact that that's now Bitcoin and the US dollar is no longer in that game is shocking, but it's not shocking because of Bitcoin. It's shocking because of how far we've departed from that ideal in just 20 years in this country. When I first came to the States, I thought I was joining a country of free markets, and apparently since the 80s, free markets are passé. Because they don't deliver outlandish profits to corporate welfare. So we're going a different way now. Well, I think a lot of people realize that's not their economy, and they're beginning to vote with their feet and their wallets and going to alternatives.
It's funny. I don't know if you've ever heard of a wonderful book by Francis Spufford. It came out in 2010. It's called Red Plenty, and it's a story of Khrushchev and their attempt to replicate market pricing, using centrally planned models that persisted, from late 1950s, really up until the final collapse of Russia. And it's a fascinating to study to see how incumbents and people in power, continue to rationalize their programs and how they hang on to the bitter end, and how reality ultimately, overwhelms them. So as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about that story and its implications for monetary systems. Because after all, Bitcoin is a technology that exists. and it's not going away ever.
Mhm. Right, and if they try to regulate one form of it, there are now 500 altcoins in existence. Here's the other interesting thing: by attempting to regulate Bitcoin, even if New York somehow succeeded, which I think is extremely unlikely, all they would do is they would encourage the development of alternatives that are much more stealthy and much more anonymous. These already exist. And at the moment, no one feels the need to switch from Bitcoin to these alternatives until, of course, New York starts getting more and more aggressive with their enforcement actions, at which point the people of New York may find it necessary to switch to stealthier versions of cryptocurrencies. We've seen this happen before. It was the evolutionary path taken from Napster to BitTorrent. In retrospect, the media and recording companies should have made a deal with Napster. Instead, what they did is they decided to ignore reality, to ignore the fact that they lived in a post-scarcity economics environment in terms of music copying, production, and distribution, and to think that they could continue to extract extravagant profits from pressing CDs. And their entire industry collapsed in on themselves because when they stomped on Napster, they got Kazaa, and when they stomped on Kazaa, they got LimeWire, and when they stomped on LimeWire and they kept stomping, eventually they got BitTorrent. And BitTorrent turned around and bit their ass. And that's exactly what's going to happen with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the most benign and friendly of cryptocurrencies. You stomp on it and you run the risk of causing it to evolve in a very rapid evolutionary environment where altcoins are spawning by the hundreds each year, and where the barrier to conversion is almost zero in these alternative exchanges. You're running the risk of driving it to an evolutionary outcome that is much, much more hostile to regulation. I think the incumbent should make a deal with Bitcoin now and count their blessings that it's relatively mild, because the alternatives are going to be even more aggressive in their evasion of regulation.
Bitcoin is very much of an open source technology. You can see everything that's going on. What's the hashing rate? How many wallets are downloaded? Obviously the price. Relative to other currencies all over the world. You follow these statistics very closely. What are the most notable trends you've seen in the last, say, several months?
Things have been relatively quiet in Bitcoin as a currency. I think we've seen kind of the volatility has decreased a bit. Things have stabilized at a couple of different plateau levels. We saw kind of a plateau at about 600. Now we're seeing a plateau at about 500. It's reset a bit. And the trading volumes have decreased. But I think what's happening that's most interesting, the most interesting thing that's happening behind the scenes, is the fact that an industry was born. That we went from 2 or 3 companies in the space to now hundreds of companies. That we went from a few hundred developers having skills in the space to developers leaving established industries by droves and retooling and reskilling in cryptocurrencies and taking seminars by the hundreds and participating in developer meetups by the hundreds and then the thousands and then the tens of thousands, trying to learn, trying to drink from this fountain of knowledge about cryptocurrencies because they see the future. They know that this is a source of skills and potential jobs that will lead to a future career. And so young people retooling, young people dropping out of school in order to do startups in this space, and to become pioneers in this space, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of startups all over the world launching in this space. And it's barely started. We're still at the very earliest stage, the infancy of this currency. And yet in 2014, the amount of investment and the number of companies in Bitcoin exceeded the rate of investment and number of companies that the internet had in 1995. This thing has started exploding in terms of innovation, and that has nothing to do with the currency. The technology innovation and the jobs that are being generated here, this is a little engine of growth, is generating its own economic activity, and that economic activity will not convert US dollar activity because there's no productivity there. What it will do is it will create its own economy. And so the future of Bitcoin, we have to realize is not how much more shopping you do on Bitcoin versus the US dollar. That's a bit like asking in the internet age, well, how many fax machines did the internet displace? In the end, it didn't. It simply made them irrelevant. It didn't displace fax machines, it made them irrelevant. It didn't displace phone companies, it made them irrelevant, it took away their power. It didn't displace the record companies, it made them irrelevant. It didn't displace newspapers, it made them irrelevant. And you can't measure the internet in terms of internet sold or faxes sent or phone calls made, because all of those things are the old metrics that don't apply to the new paradigm. And so in the end, I think Bitcoin is going to displace a lot of these things by creating completely new models of economic activity, of innovation, of crowdfunding, of startups, of crowd lending, of crowd payment systems, new economic activity that has nothing to do with the old model. That's what's exciting. And you can't measure that with the old metrics. The old metrics are completely irrelevant in that scenario.
I saw this morning, I think on the Bitcoin subreddit, there's some new data about Overstock.com, which was a very early mover into the retail space of Bitcoin, and it's benefited the company enormously. And I can tell you, you know, as a startup entrepreneur myself, that within Liberty.me, you know, Bitcoin has benefited us hugely, not only in terms of our crowdfunding campaign going into it, but like day to day. You know, I've got people all over the world signing up using Bitcoin. This is unimaginable, you know, 5-10 years ago. It's incredible.
Yeah, I think the key there is all over the world. The key is not how much of your existing economic activity you convert, because your existing economic activity operates within a closed system. If you're using credit cards, you're operating within a closed system of the people who own credit cards and the people who are within a country that allows them to use credit cards for your services internationally in a foreign currency. And that is a vanishingly small part of the human community. We're talking about you know, maybe 400 to 500 million people around the world. You're looking at people who have PayPal, which only exists in a dozen countries. There are 194 countries out there. And then you have Bitcoin, which can be used from anywhere, even with an SMS phone, from somewhere that doesn't have internet connectivity. And suddenly you realize that this opens up the possibility of engaging in trade with all 7.5 billion people on this planet. And the thing is, most people don't really think about this. Why is it that 6.5 billion people are economically isolated with bank accounts that can't trade internationally, that can't use international currencies, or with no bank accounts at all? Why is that? Is it because they don't have money? Is it because they don't have productive capacity? Is it because they have nothing to trade? If you think that, then you have failed to appreciate your own privilege. The truth is that through an accident of birth, they were born in a country where it is politically impossible to have that kind of level of development, where there isn't sufficient infrastructure to get bricks and mortar institutions that have very high overheads and friction, and where their own government will try to steal every penny that they try to push through those institutions, so they naturally distrust them. Now, when you give them the ability to do this without friction, these people have productive capacity. These people have things they want to trade with the rest of the world, and up to now, they've been cut off. When you connect humanity on a global level with economic opportunity and international trade without intermediaries, without huge frictional costs, without hard borders, it changes the very nature of the global economy. And the amount of trade that can happen dwarfs today's GDP for any country. So this isn't about converting our Amazon sales from US dollar into Bitcoin. I mean, if Amazon adopts Bitcoin, great. I'm going to celebrate. Bitcoin's price is going to go up. But that's not the point. That is not the point. The point is, if you bootstrap international trade on an equal footing without intermediaries and borders, you can completely change the face of this planet, and you can have participation by billions of people who currently are disconnected from this system. And that is very big news.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for spelling that out. I only discerned this about a year after getting into the Bitcoin world. You know, the whole subject of Bitcoin is so huge, the implications are so ominous. Sometimes it's difficult to fully understand the implications, or you know, what matters and what doesn't matter. So I think your big picture analysis here is profound and significant, and will be understood in 10 to 20 years probably. So I wanted to
This is the internet of money, and if we look at what the internet has done, so far the internet has only reached 2.5 billion people across the world out of 7.5 billion, and already it has changed the face of this planet, completely changed the face of this planet. It shrunk this globe and instantly made it much, much smaller, where people all around the world can share their experience. Recently there's been some political turmoil in the U.S., which is rather interesting. You know, you have some police activity in Ferguson and militarized riot cops. And one of the things that I found fascinating was watching people from Gaza, people from Cairo, people from Turkey, people from Indonesia giving the citizens of Ferguson in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, giving them advice on how to protect themselves from tear gas.
Right.
And this is
scary.
Astounding. I mean, it's really, you get this sense of global community. It's not just about us finding out what's happening in Cairo. It's about, protesters in Cairo, Gaza, and Ferguson now seeing a common cause, a shared brotherhood, a shared community spirit, even if it's just about how you mix antacid with water to rinse out your eyes when you've been tear gassed by the cops. This is a completely new world, and we're only beginning to see the implications of a global internet, and that's just a communication medium that's only reached 2.5 billion people. Now we're talking about the internet of money that opens up that to economic activity. I don't think people have even begun to grasp how big this is and how enormously it's going to affect the world around us.
Andreas, it's always just an unbelievable pleasure to talk to you. I'm so glad I was able to call you up today. It's amazing, and I hope we can have these discussions more often. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
I'd love to anytime. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Touched on it. I said, my God, I'd love to have a transcript of that. But in today's online world, you say something like that, and next thing you know, you've got a transcript in your inbox, which is exactly what happened.
Yes, I saw that when I went online. It was pretty cool.
That was cute. So I wanted to kind of like back up a second here and raise a couple of issues that you are in a very special position to sort of discuss, that I feel like I'm not quite fully up on. One thing concerns this New York financial regulation of Bitcoin. We're seeing very aggressive attempts these days to essentially to control Bitcoin, to regulate it in a way that would even be more intensely regulated than regular cash. And I think, I mean, it's interesting because early on I got into the Bitcoin world about a year and a half ago now, and the most common thing I heard from people who were sort of debunkers of it was, forget it. This will never be allowed.
And guess what? Bitcoin doesn't fit into that hole. The peg doesn't fit into that hole, and that's not a bug. That's a feature. It's not a bug that it's difficult to make peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies comply with these ridiculous draconian totalitarian regulations that New York's trying to pass. It's a feature that they can't comply. They shouldn't be able to comply. They disrupt the very nature of totalitarian financial surveillance, and that's a good thing. That's how it should be. They change the balance of power from financial service industry companies that can collect everything about everyone and empower the consumer to be able to protect their own financial information from these parasitic organizations that want to apply their own view of the world. And so that's a feature. And I don't think Bitcoin's going to fit in well with this regulatory fantasy. I think what it's going to do is it's going to isolate New York. And I'm not surprised this came out of New York. Of course, New York is going to be resistant to peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies. London and New York are the last bastion of old-style parasitic capitalism, and they will get from that information. Makes everybody blackmailable. And so the thing is, the financial information and financial privacy, we have this weird situation where regulators try to persuade us that the way to create consumer protection is to give up financial privacy. And financial privacy is consumer protection, and giving up all of your private information in order to interact with someone else, consumer protection, it's incumbent protection, and it's actually antithetical to consumer protection. It destroys the possibility of an individual to protect their identity from identity theft, and it exposes them to every hacker who can get into any of the records of any of the companies or regulators or intermediaries who are involved in the system. I mean, that's one of the main pain points and problems with the current financial system. So they're taking a feature of these new peer-to-peer cryptocurrencies, which is the fact that you don't have to provide all of this personal financial information and become a victim of identity theft, and turning it around and trying to eradicate that feature by making Bitcoin conform more to the established yet completely failed banking practices of totalitarian financial surveillance.
The powers that be will stop this through some sort of regulation. We've all known this kind of thing is coming. Everybody anticipated it. It's not as if we're naive. We understand this. There's nothing in this world that's allowed to exist that's not heavily regulated and controlled by the state. I guess my question to you is, how substantial a change is this? Do you think it's affected the mood in the Bitcoin world? Do you think this is just a passing annoyance or a fundamental shift?
I think it's a passing annoyance, and I think it will greatly annoy the citizens of the state of New York, who will be deprived of financial privacy at a time when financial privacy is so difficult to achieve, when totalitarian financial surveillance is almost taken for granted. People complain about the NSA tapping our phones, but they seem to take it for granted that every podunk sheriff's office can pull your credit card files because of the Patriot Act Section 215 and share them with each other with reckless abandon and track your every financial move online. And it is incredible what people can.
Andreas Antonopoulos, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining me in this hangout.
Hey Jeffrey, I'm very excited. Since we're streaming live, if you send me the YouTube, I'd like to tweet it out to my followers so they can join us too.
Okay. I wonder how I do. If I can just get the link, I suppose. You want them to join us live, or just after we're done?
No, live YouTube link would be perfect.
Okay.
I can throw it up there if you send it in the chat or something.
Yeah.
Or email it to me, whatever works.
I'm going to put this in the chat. We had a bang-up time talking the other day on Let's Talk Bitcoin. It was really great, and that little conversation was quite a hit online. You remember?
Yeah, absolutely. I always enjoy chatting with you, Jeffrey, and I think it was a great topic, the nature of scientific discovery and disruption of entrenched paradigms and dogma in science was very interesting.
Well, it was funny because you were so eloquent, and I was so